Pastoral care. A participant in the Vatican's meeting on the Amazon tells us why the church's presence in the region is so important. Ready for battle. Tensions are rising between President Donald Trump and House Democrats over the impeachment investigation. We have the latest. Fighting for the faithful. We hear about the Trump administration's efforts to defend religious freedom. And converting our hearts. Pope Francis tells the faithful the best way to love others. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, October 9th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Nearly 200 church leaders and 25 experts are at the Vatican, continuing their discussions as to how the church can environmentally and pastorally care for the Amazon region. One group adding their input today is REPAM, a Catholic church network located in all 9 countries of the Amazon, promoting the rights and dignity of people living in that region. REPAM is backed by the Latin American Bishops' Conference. Mauricio Lopez is the executive secretary of REPAM and a synod participant. He joins us now from Rome. Mauricio, thank you so much for your time and joining us here on the program. Why is the church in all of these countries worried about the situation in the Amazon?
Well, thank you for the invitation here today. It's very important to notice that for all those 9 countries, the Amazon territory or ecosystem represents more than half of their own national territory. So we are connected in so many ways. So the church acts and works together in all this vast diversity.
I'm hoping you can give me a concrete example. How does the dialogue between the church and indigenous peoples work exactly?
Well, there are very different kinds of approaches, but I think the most important one is that you have a large number of indigenous who are there and who are Catholics and have been Catholics ever since the beginning in the encounter of the cultures. So they take part of the regular life of the church. It's just very difficult sometimes to reach out to them, but they have, if you may, a more traditional way of organizing themselves. There are other ways in which also the church accompanies them in concrete processes, but trying to adapt and encounter a progressive way to somehow also respect their own cultures, and as the Vatican Council II expresses, to help them and bring what's also a source of life for the church. And there will be a third way in which we try to accompany them in terms of what Laudato Si expresses: defending life, protecting the future of the planet, and protecting their own territories.
One of your focuses is mapping the Amazon, which covers around 5.3 million square kilometers. Why is that necessary, and how do you actually go about doing that?
Well, you will find it very interesting, but in many cases, bishops working in their own territories do not have enough data of what's happening. Sometimes statistics about the numbers of people working for the church, religious congregations, where they are, what they do, are not so clear. So we felt a concrete need from the bishops themselves, which in the Amazon account for more than 100, so we could provide them with a better understanding of what's happening, so they can respond to their reality in a better way. Actually, it is meant for them to have their own apostolic and pastoral planning, so they can actually respond to what's happening there.
It's incredible when you think about the vast region there, and obviously we appreciate the work that you do. Mauricio Lopez, Executive Secretary of REPAM, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting us.
The White House sends a letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi refusing to cooperate with the impeachment inquiry. Administration officials call the investigation illegitimate and unconstitutional. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. It's become a war of words between the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and President Trump, who now, just like he called the Russia investigation, is calling this impeachment inquiry the greatest scam and witch hunt in the history of our country.
President Trump continues to block House Democrats in their investigation efforts. In a letter to the Speaker of the House, the President's White House counsel Pat Cipollone tells Nancy Pelosi she failed to call for an official House vote before proceeding with the impeachment inquiry. He writes, "You have designed and implemented your inquiry in a manner that violates fundamental fairness and constitutionally mandated due process." The White House says lawmakers voted to begin impeachment inquiries into President Nixon and President Clinton. But in response to the letter calling her inquiry unconstitutional, Pelosi writes, "Mr. President, you are not above the law. You will be held accountable." The whole investigation centers around a call in which President Trump asked the president of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden and his son Hunter. The president says he was just trying to uncover corruption, and it had nothing to do with undermining his political rival.
This is a scam, and the people are wise to it, and that's why my polls went up. I think they said 17 points in the last 2 or 3 days. I've never had that one. So I think it's very sad for our country.
Today, President Trump sounding off on Twitter. The whistleblower and others spoke before seeing the transcript. Now they must apologize to me and stop this ridiculous impeachment. The president's son adding,
"You saw the Russia witch hunt play out over the last 3 years. Now it's the Ukraine witch hunt, right?"
And now we're hearing from the president's political rival, Joe Biden, who's growing more outraged. He says the president has violated his oath of office and should be impeached. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. House Democrats leading the impeachment inquiry say they are well within their constitutional rights. They note that the Constitution itself says Congress has the sole power of impeachment, but there's no manual to follow, no step-by-step rules. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi joins us with more on what some call a war on the impeachment probe. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. It is Congress's role to set the rules for impeachment. That's what a House lawyer told a judge. But Republicans are saying that the process set up by the Democrats is unfair, and now we have more going on here on Capitol Hill.
Republicans defend the White House against the Democrats' impeachment probe.
We just know how biased and unfair they've been conducting this whole process.
So the Trump administration puts the brakes on Democrat Adam Schiff's investigation.
I've never once seen the rules that he's put in place where they can't have the agency counsel lawyer there with them, where he tried to limit members from even asking questions. So it's a completely unfair process. And I don't blame the White House one bit for saying, and the State Department one bit for saying that Ambassador Sondland shouldn't come until this is a legitimate and fair process.
The Trump administration yesterday blocked the testimony of the ambassador to the EU. House Democrats now subpoenaed him, and they say the blockage is evidence of obstruction.
And we know that the ambassador has relevant evidence on whether the meeting with the president that the Ukrainians desperately sought with President Trump was being conditioned on these investigations that the president believed would help his re-election campaign.
Democrats are in court trying to get documents, including grand jury testimony from special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation.
I don't think that their stonewalling will hold up. I think that the courts will do what they did in the Nixon case and make them turn over the documents.
And a friend of the president warns the commander-in-chief.
I believe it's a mortal threat to his presidency. He certainly should treat it that way.
A brand new poll from NBC and the Wall Street Journal finds only 43% of Americans think the president should right now be removed from office. But more than a majority, 55% of Americans do support this Democratic impeachment investigation. Wyatt?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. And joining me now with her analysis is Star Parker, president and founder of Urban Cure, the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, a public policy institute based here in Washington. Star, welcome back to the program. Democrats are moving forward, of course, with their investigation. As we've been saying, the Trump administration says it won't participate. It doesn't let administration officials participate in some of the questioning. What's your reaction as you watch all of this unfold?
Well, my reaction is I'm glad I penned my new book called Necessary Noise so that I can be a part of the discussion as the American people try to sort through what is going on here in Washington, D.C. Because you can get lost. You can get lost in the details. But the bigger story, the bigger moment for us as Christian people is that we are in a cultural war, and it's coming to a head. 63 million people said we couldn't go on anymore the way that we were. We were going very secular. We were going very statist toward socialism, and they understood that this country was built on principles of Christianity, virtues of capitalism, a rule of law in our Constitution. All of these things were at risk in the 2016 election. the side that wants to protect those interests won. The courts are reshaping. Abortion is being ridden from our midst, and the people, the enemies of the Lord, let's just call them what they are really upset. So they're looking for any and all reasons to stop the momentum that is taking place here in Washington. So impeachment is a part of that.
Some legal experts are saying this impasse between the House Democrats and the president has the nation headed for, or perhaps already has put us in, a constitutional crisis. What are your concerns about the impact this is having, either constitutionally and the way we think about the country?
Well, they're tremendous. We should be very concerned. These are the same people who wanted to get rid of the Electoral College so that everyone's interests are represented. These are the same people that think that the Constitution is breathing already. These are the same people who have been legislating from the bench. All of that has been realigned. But yes, we should be concerned about constitutional upsets, including that a sitting president of the country has to release private discussions with a foreign leader. I'm glad that the American people are having this discussion. I hope that we don't get lost in the details as the Democrats continue to force us to say in the next election cycle, who do we really want to be? Do we want to be biblical and free, or do we want to be secular and statist? And that's what really is at stake in all of these questions.
Well, let me follow up with you about that, because you mentioned the election. Obviously, we're going to continue to hear more about this inquiry in the next several weeks and months. How do you think all of this, for both parties, how is this going to play out for voters, do you think, in the election?
Well, I think that clarity is going to be determined, and that's why I appreciate EWTN, if I can give you a plug, to get to the people, to the Catholic community, a little bit more clarity, to look for where their values are, their virtues are, and what it is that they want. Do we want the Sisters of the Poor dragged through court because they don't want to do abortion? Do we want our health providers in the homeless shelters to have to deal with this transgender thing? What kind of country do we want for ourselves, for our children, and for our grandchildren? And that's what's at stake in the next election. Make no mistake, it's going to get a lot noisier before that election, but we want to be resolved to know what we're voting for next year.
All right, a lot of important values, a lot of important issues to think about. Star Parker, president and founder of the Center for Urban Renewal and Education. Thanks so much for coming on and talking with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Turkish forces have launched a military operation against Kurdish fighters in Syria. Smoke was seen rising from the Turkey-Syria border following a series of airstrikes. The offensive began soon after U.S. forces left the area. There were signs of panic in the streets of one town in the northeastern part of the country. Turkish President Recep Erdogan announced the campaign. He says it will prevent more terror in the region. On Sunday, President Trump said American troops in the area will step aside. The Kurds have been allies with the United States in the fight against ISIS, but Turkey views the Kurds as terrorists. At least 2 people are dead following a shooting in Germany. Several shots were fired in the town of Halle. The suspects appeared to target a synagogue and a kebab shop. So far, 1 person has been arrested. Police have not released any information about a possible motive for the attack. However, Jewish leaders note that today is Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism. Coming up, we hear about efforts to protect children from sexualization in culture and education. Policy experts, educators, and doctors gather in Washington today to discuss how to protect the nation's children from sexualization in culture, education, and healthcare. They say children are increasingly exposed to sexual messages, images, and themes at younger and younger ages. Joining me now by Skype from the Heritage Foundation is one of the moderators of today's discussion, Senior Research Fellow Ryan Anderson. Ryan is also the author of the book, When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. Ryan, welcome back to the program. Why do you think children today are exposed to so many sexual messages? What's going on in our society?
A lot of this seems to spring from the sexual revolution. A lot of bad ideas came out of the 1960s, and now 50 years later, we're reaping the rotted fruit from that tree. And so what we're seeing is an increase in sexual messages directed at children, an increase in the sexualization of children, not just in the culture, but at school. And now I think most startling and most kind of alarming is through the medical and healthcare professionals, especially when you look at new medical interventions into young people's bodies when it comes to gender dysphoria and transgender treatment.
A lot of problems for sure. Much of today's conversation focused on parental rights. As you know, parents don't often have as much control as what their children are exposed to in schools as they would like. So give us some examples of what students are being taught that's caused concern.
Sure. I mean, this ranges from what's being taught as part of the explicit sex education program, so what's going to be taught as part of like the safe sex program, but also what's being taught in the biology class. People are being taught that transgender identities are biological truths, that the gender unicorn and the genderbread person are revealing truths about the human condition. What's being taught in anti-bullying programs that are actually just indoctrinating students into a new ideology about which appropriate pronouns to use, about what is true for the 56 different gender options. So it's not just kind of the traditional concerns about sex education. It's now reaching a much broader array of topics of even how do we understand our own bodies and our own identities.
Well, what do you think are the consequences for our young people? How does all this impact them mentally as they grow up?
Sure. I mean, that's a question that we won't even know the answer to for 10, 15, 20 years from now when we look back. The concern is that many young people just aren't getting the formation that they deserve. That what's taking place at schools, the government-run public schools are not supposed to be supplanting parents. They're supposed to be cooperating with parents to instill values in the children. And so we have no idea what the long-term consequences will be. Many people report increasing feelings of alienation, loneliness, depression, anxiety. Whether or not this is isolated outcomes or if this is part of the increase in sexualization of children, it's too soon to tell. But regardless of the consequences, we can know that it's not good to be exposing children to false, contrary, harmful ideas about their own bodies and their own identities.
So then to that end, what advice do you have for parents, especially parents with more conservative viewpoints?
The first is not to cave, not to give in. The other side is trying to intimidate you into silence. Their strategy is to call you names, to bully you, to intimidate you so you don't speak out. Realize that whether it's in the Hollywood setting, the culture setting, the healthcare setting, or the education setting, parents have authority for the upbringing and guidance and direction of their children. And so you should exercise that authority. You should challenge the principal or the teacher or the school administrator if they're doing something that's not beneficial for your child. You should challenge the doctor, the psychiatrist, the school nurse if they're doing something that's not beneficial for the child. And you certainly shouldn't let them usurp your authority as the parent and indoctrinate your child into harmful and false beliefs.
A lot of alarming trends here, but some good advice for parents out there. Ryan Anderson, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation and author of the book, When Harry Became Sally. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Up next, Pope Francis tells the faithful what they can learn from the conversion of St. Paul. And a Trump administration official tells us why he is fighting for religious freedom. The Department of Justice says the Archdiocese of Indianapolis was within its rights to fire a former Catholic school teacher for being in a same-sex relationship.
We felt it was appropriate to file a statement of interest in that case to explain to the court that the Archdiocese of Indiana has a right to associate with whomever it chooses, and it has a right to govern itself as a church organization, and that its rights are protected by the First Amendment.
Eric Dryband is the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the Department of Justice. He wrote the statement supporting the Archdiocese. Supporters of the president say this is just one example of the Trump administration's emphasis on defending religious freedom. Joining us now is Roger Severino, Director of the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services. Roger, welcome back to the broadcast. Late last month, you said your work defending religious liberty is your most important legacy at HHS. Why do you say that?
Well, it's our fundamental freedom, and I'm privileged and honored to be a part of what President Trump has set in motion. He set in motion a reinvigorated defense of religious freedom to make sure that this fundamental human right becomes an institutionalized part of our government so that it is treated at least as well as every other civil right. And for too many years, for too long, these rights have not been respected. And I think you're right that my legacy will be what we've done to respect conscience and religious freedom at HHS and hopefully beyond. And I'm very proud of the work of my team in achieving that important milestone.
There were nearly 350 religious conscience complaints last year. Why were there so many, and is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's good that people are coming forward because they know that we are there to help them, that we're there to enforce the law. We're receiving a little over 1 complaint per year in the previous 8 years before the Trump administration, and now we're getting them in the hundreds. And it's indicative of a couple things. One, that there's a new openness, that we are open for business and that people are aware that we stand ready to defend their rights. And two, that there's an actual real problem with discrimination against entities and people who simply want to live their faith in the healthcare space and not be driven out of healthcare because of their religious beliefs. If you're a religious hospital, a religious practitioner, for example, you should never be forced by your boss to perform or assist in abortions. And there should be room for everybody in America, and the American people have spoken through their laws saying that these sorts of things, when it comes to conscience, must be protected. And we are giving life to these laws, which is why we've announced that we're open, we're getting the complaints, and we're now doing enforcement actions to hold institutions accountable when they violate the law.
You mentioned being forced to participate in abortion. I remember in August, your department provided information about a university medical center in Vermont forcing a Catholic nurse to assist with an abortion. Not much information has been released since then. Do we have any updates on that case?
The university has said some encouraging things about their willingness to reconsider their policies, and we are in discussions with them. We're hopeful we could reach a resolution, but we are prepared for any eventuality. We always seek first voluntary resolution, but we stand ready to enforce the law to the fullest extent where necessary. But the message is getting out that we are enforcing. We did an enforcement action against the state of California that went after pregnancy resource centers. Same thing with the state of Hawaii. And we reached good resolution there where the state of Hawaii said they will not enforce discriminatory laws against pregnancy resource centers who refuse to refer for abortions. And again, these institutions exist solely to give women another option besides abortion. Yet when states go after them because of their beliefs, the Supreme Court has already said this likely violates the First Amendment, and we're also saying it violates conscience protections in federal law.
Well, let me follow up with you on that, because some groups, have pushed back against your efforts, saying, among other things, you're imposing religious views on them. How do you respond to that?
It's about respecting everybody's religious beliefs and those that don't have religious beliefs. Imagine a world where religious institutions were kicked out of the healthcare space. There would be fewer options for people. There would be less diversity. When you respect conscience and religious freedom, you respect a multitude of different perspectives. And especially when it comes to issues of life and death, the American people say there should be no coercion. We don't require pharmacists to issue lethal cocktails that would execute duly convicted prisoners. We don't force people who object to war to take life in war. We provide accommodations on these issues of life and death, and abortion should be no exception, and in fact, it's protected under federal law. Folks who are protected from discrimination are finally getting the relief that they've wanted for years because we're in business, and this is a business that is not going to go anywhere until the law is fully complied with.
Religious liberty continues to be such an important issue for our viewers, and that's why we appreciate your coming on here to give us a summary about your efforts. Roger Severino with the Department of Health and Human Services, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Finally tonight, Pope Francis says those who are struggling to love others can learn from the conversion of the Apostle Paul.
Preguntándole, Saulo, Saulo, ¿por qué me persigues?
At his weekly talk to pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father says God changed Paul's heart from hate to love, and his conversion to Christianity is a sign of God's life-changing love for each of us. All we have to do is ask. And on that positive note, we conclude our newscast for tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.